Leslie has impacted my life in a number of ways. Before 2000, I was a timid, scared person who did not like to stand up in front of a group of people. And I was invited to a healthcare conference on concerning LGBT people, and Leslie was the keynote speaker. And 20 minutes before this panel discussion, I was told I was to be a part of it. I hadn't prepared anything. I was totally scared. Well, I reached down and grabbed one of the stories that I told and felt that afterwards I'd done a bad job. Well, Leslie encouraged me and told me that I had touched people's hearts and that I needed to continue sharing the story. So it's because of her inspiration that I'm doing what I'm doing now, and I can only thank her for being a wonderful role model and someone who creates energy where there was none before. So I hope that you're here today to get a little bit of that energy and to take it home and to see what you can do with it. So please join me in welcoming Leslie Feinberg to Buffalo.
Thank you. Can you hear me? This is a funny kind of mic. You can hear me in the back? Thank you for welcoming me home. Buffalo really is my home, although I wasn't born here. I just read on Wikipedia that I was born in Buffalo, but actually, I wasn't born in Buffalo. It's the problem with user-updated things. It's both a strength and a weakness. I was actually born in Kansas City, Missouri, but this is my home. For all the memories that I have coming back here, driving down the streets, seeing the rainbow flags up hanging from the lampposts on a main drag, no pun intended, in Buffalo. It was a big surprise to me, and I want to thank Paul Walls, and I want to thank all the sponsoring organizations. Particularly, I want to thank Joanna and Camille and all the people. You know, the people who send you the most emails are taking a lot of weight on their shoulders as organizers. I recognize that. And it's an amazing thing for me to be here, both with old friends and with new friends, and to be together at this moment in time, which I think of as such a critical moment in not just the history of Buffalo or this country, but the history of the world. What we do now will help set the trajectory of the arc of history now. And I was thinking about having grown up in Buffalo and how when I was about 5, I actually got my first library card here, and they couldn't keep me out of the library after that. I kept looking for things. I kept looking for explanations. I wanted to know why this city was divided with an apartheid divide down Main Street. I wanted to know why racism among whites seemed to be like a religion, like an ideology. I wanted to know why during the McCarthyite witch hunt everybody was so afraid when they read the newspaper, why they whispered to each other. I wanted to know what the jokes were about Christine Jorgensen, but I didn't quite want to know if they had any relevance to my life. I wanted to know why everyone kept asking me whether I was a boy or a girl, and why it didn't even matter what I answered, because it seemed the very fact that they had to ask had already labeled me as an outlaw. I kept looking in the library. There's this little library on Delaware and Hurdle. You know that one? I loved that library. I perused those shelves. I read everything I could find. But you know, there was a terrible moment in my life when I realized that the books I was looking to read, I might have to write them. And I'm sure there are some authors in this room, some very accomplished authors who have written some. I'm looking at Alexis DeVoe here. There's also other books here that haven't been written yet and that need to be written as well. Working class stories, stories of oppressed lives, lives that have not been elevated to print, to media, to blockbuster films. And I set out to write these books because I felt, well, I went to Bennett High School. I didn't graduate. I ended up on the campus helping tear down that Themis building because I worked in factories and everybody I knew who went away for the war wasn't coming back. And if they did come back, they weren't coming back the same. The campus was another world to me. It really was, and not a world I could navigate very easily. But I didn't grow up going to Bennett High School thinking that I was going to write books. And in fact, I was very, very anti-intellectual. I really had an attitude that intellectualism was, well, I'm not even going to say it. I had disdain for what I thought intellectualism was. I thought it was the obfuscation of truth, that it was the burying of truth. And I didn't understand that there was such a thing as working class intellectualism. And I remember reading an African proverb. I haven't been able to discover from which country on that mighty continent. But as part of the activist contribution of the national liberation movements of the 60s and 70s and earlier in the 50s that had helped shape the consciousness of many of us as white working class kids in Buffalo too, is that until the lions come to power, the history of the hunt glorifies the hunter. And I wanted to be part of that activist tradition of the lions talking about the true human toll of the hunter's history. I wanted to be part of helping to reclaim just some of the voices that had been buried. And so, I sure knew when I read my history books in Bennett High School that I wasn't getting the truth. In fact, my history teacher was reported to be one of the leaders of the John Birch Society, and if she wasn't, and it wasn't true, she easily could have qualified, I'll tell you. The position was open for her. But the first book that I wrote was Stone Butch Blues, and it was, as some of you here know, set in Buffalo, set in the blue-collar drag bars of Buffalo, some of the only places in the city at that time in which Black and Latino and Native and white people, both female-bodied and male-bodied, could sit together after having sometimes worked together all day in the factories, could sit together, drink together. And they were rough places to be. And certainly, sometimes people ask now, why did you go there if there was going to be police raids and so much violence? As though we were picking dangerous places to go. And say, I don't know if you understand this, but we were the danger. We were the dangerous people. The danger followed us where we went, but it followed us down the street to work, it followed us home, it followed us on the way to the bar, it followed us to get a quart of milk, it followed us to the bowling alley, it followed us to the softball field. And therefore, when we came together, and particularly when we drew on a diversity that we didn't see anywhere else in the city, we had a different strength and a different power potentially than we had when we were alone getting caught on the streets with people who had already made sure to bring tire irons and baseball bats. So it's not that we went to places that were dangerous, it's that the places we went to gather in community and communities were where the danger came. So when I first wrote Stone Butch Blues, it was in a period when there was a discussion about butch-femme relationships amongst some newer generations of lesbians. But the people who were being discussed hadn't been in the room for a long time, and that skews the discussion. It always does. If everybody's not in the room speaking with their own voices about their own experiences, their own truths, their own oppressions, then there's a way of kind of glossing over, oh, we all experience the same thing and we're just discussing this like it's abstract. So I would hear people say, well, my shoes are femme, but my shirt is butch, and what does that make me? And I would hear people say things about femme partners that just were not funny. You know, I don't want to repeat a lot, but you know what the things are. Oh, you know, she's going to be so late. You know how femmes are, probably out shopping. It's just stop right there. That's just anti-femme attitudes, whether it's towards female-bodied femmes or male-bodied femmes. This is just a distillation of woman-hating. There's no place for that coming from us, any of us. It's not funny. And so I realized that it had been a long time since those who were being discussed as being very femme or very butch were in the room, and if you cut off those ends of the spectrum, it looks like everybody's in the middle. And I just want to say something about this, because there is a lot of a kind of a bashing of the movement, particularly women's liberation now, and the current that had lesbians that didn't identify as masculine or feminine. And you all know Rush Limbaugh is the most outspoken critic of that, you know, labeling the women's liberation movement, he leaves out the womanist current, of course, labeling it feminazis. It's on one fell swoop, both degrading and slandering the women's liberation movement for its swing forward, and in this I'm including its powerful womanist currents, and also at the same time minimizing and trivializing and ridiculing the history of fascism in Europe and its human toll. I know there was this great experiment. It was a social experiment around androgyny, and it was because of something very real, which is that, you know, second wave liberation movement around sex oppression was saying, look at the way girls and boys are socialized in the society. Look at the way masculinity and femininity is imbued with such poisonous attitudes about what people's strengths are, or their weaknesses, or their abilities, or their lack of abilities. Of course, it was not a complicated enough analysis if it didn't take into account race and nationality and class and region and historical period and all kinds of other very important analyses without which theory could not rest on reality. But it was not meant to be a mean-spirited policing of those of us who fell outside those boundaries, in my humble opinion. It was meant to liberate. It was meant to liberate people from the confines of gender, of attitudes around gender. And you know, it's a lot easier to Monday morning quarterback decades and decades later with any social experiment. But the fact is, what we could learn from it, I think, is that yes, androgyny is a very liberated gender space to be in, if you are androgynous. But if all the rapes and beatings and institutionalization and shock therapy, if all the humiliation and the hounding and the being driven out of employment or out of housing or being turned away from an ER when you're sick or bleeding or injured, if that's not enough to change our gender expression, then why would censorship from a movement? All it did was narrow and narrow and narrow the view of what it meant to be liberated in your gender expression. And the fact is that I don't really believe that there is a liberated space on which to stand for gender. There is just what we are each fighting for, our right to be who we are, how we dress, how we walk, how we move through the world, who we relate to, how we hold ourselves with friends and loved ones, how we face an enemy. how we deal with opponents who are not enemies. These are the ways in which we are gendered, and I don't think there's even language for it. There was an old amongst some white butches and femmes that I knew in Buffalo, there was sort of a party game, and it was about ranking people as butch or femme. It was after people had had a few drinks. Now, I'm not suggesting playing this game anymore, because the ranking of gender expression, particularly around femininity and masculinity, which is so loaded and is so poisoned, the concepts around it, meant that those who got 10s thought they were better than those who got 4s. But it was an interesting experiment to see from the standpoint that the word masculine or feminine, even within the context of presumably one nationality, one circle of friends, one class in one region, was not enough to describe who was there. Some people would say, well, I gave her a 9. And the others would say, a 9? I gave her a 3. Now that showed that even people in the same room who knew the same person as friends viewed them with different degrees of gender. And then the person in the middle of the circle would say, you gave me a 3? I'm not getting out of this circle till you give me a 10. That said to me that people, we view ourselves in a way sometimes that's different than the way that we are viewed. And the other thing is that we just have these two words, masculine and feminine. And then androgyny is sort of supposed to be a half and half. You know, kind of an in the middle of part of one and part of another. And I don't think that's enough to describe what exists. I think that experiment was very important if we study the lessons of it. The lessons that I draw from it are that, yes, we need to have a thoroughgoing consciousness-raising groups, and by that I mean, for those who weren't part of them, they weren't just talk shops about oppression. They were strategy and tactic meetings about how to deal with oppression. They were putting together, they were a meeting of minds and a figuring out how to take action, to mobilize, to change that reality. But I also think that there's another wing of that. Yes, we have to examine all the attitudes that we've been taught about gender, and all the ways that they stifle the potential of who we thought we might be when we were little, and we thought the world was not going to beat us down, was not going to limit us if we could help it, until the institutionalized obstacles that were there in place began to do their work. But the other thing is that we are, I mean, no matter whether we think of being issued a cloth of blue, a bolt of blue cloth or a bolt of pink cloth, look at what each of us have individually fashioned from just one of those two bolts of cloth. Look at what we're wearing. Look at who we are and what we've made of ourselves with it. There are not two words. If I said, okay, all masculine people on this side of the room and all feminine people on this side of the room, I have no idea where I would sit, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I will only claim the term masculine for myself as a female as long as the putting together of those two terms is an outlaw status. And I wear this suit and tie today as a reminder that for many years I walked through the streets of Buffalo, risking arrest for wearing just this clothing. Now that the laws are no longer on the books, the question is, am I liberated? Am I really free? Or can the police just hound and harass me now because they don't think I'm in the right bathroom, no matter which it is? Or because queerness is its own kind of transgression still, whether the laws are on the books or not. I think of the two words feminine and gender, and when we're talking about ways of being between gender, I think of the words feminine and masculine as being so inadequate to describe the ways we express ourselves. I think it's like if all of meteorological science were reduced to the words hot and cold, and before I had come here to Buffalo, I had turned on the Weather Channel, and they had said, it's going to be hot and hot and hot, and then it's going to be cold, I would have had no idea how to dress. How we come to express who we are with this limited language and these limited concepts and the institutionalized enforcing of gender. It's not merely a discussion of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but an actually enforced system is something that I think is going to determine who can be in the movement. Because I certainly know that if we keep narrowing it and narrowing it to who's being a woman the right way, in a liberated way, whose gender expression shows true consciousness against patriarchy, and who appears to be selling out to the patriarchy from what they're wearing or how they dress or who they love, that the movement will get narrowed down to me and you, and I'm not so sure about you. When really, we need a movement that needs you and you and you and you and me, and not walking through the door being judged for who we are, but being appreciated for who we are. And I want to say this about difference, because, you know, I hear people talk about unity, and it's important to talk about unity. But unity on what basis? I'm not so wild about, you know, when I was here at the helping defend the reproductive rights clinics, down here on Main Street twice. I've been here for that, actually. Twice they've come, the right wing, and twice we've mobilized. I remember somebody started the chant, and this was a white organizer on the picket line, started a chant, gay, straight, black, white, same struggle, same fight. And you know, I don't like that chant. It's not that I don't want to see unity in the struggle, but unity on what basis? Just saying, you know, that like the vice president of the chapter of the bank that I go to is a white gay man. And then you have combatants at the Stonewall Rebellion like Sylvia Rivera, who lived homeless on the streets of New York as a Latina transgender person since she was 10 years old. That's not the same struggle and the same fight. There's got to be a way to express unity that says we don't have to bury the fact that people in this movement are shouldering and bearing different burdens of oppression, different weights of oppression, and that the more we recognize that, the more we support each other, self-educate about each other's oppression, find ways to build coalition that bring in all of our demands, I think the more powerful that movement becomes. But it also enriches us with a greater understanding of the ways that oppression operates in the society, and of the many ways there are to be a human being. The ways there are, you know, what oppression, that both the toll it takes and the strengths it has developed, the courage that it has developed, the articulation it has developed. So I want to think, can we say all unite to fight the right, or all unite to show our might, or something? To me, the truth that I cut my teeth on coming out into the factories when I was 14 years old here in Buffalo was that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that when it came time that the contract was almost up, and the foreman started their racist jokes and their needling of the men to say, you know, the women, those who are married, they have 2 incomes. They're not going to be with you in the strike. You can't count on them. And making fun of the butches, which bathroom are they going to use? Making all these little, to see where they could drive the wedge, where they could take the fault lines of oppression and widen them. If the whites didn't stop that so-called joke before it was out of their mouth, if the men didn't say, I don't want to hear it, if the straight workers didn't say, don't even start, then the strike was already lost. The contract was already lost. And when we fought together, and I don't want to say stood up together, because I'm trying to get rid of every ableist bit of language in my vocabulary. If you hear me saying that, you just stop me if you hear it. But if we did unite, and if we compiled all of our grievances, all of the grievances, both not just economic, but the social grievances on the shop floor, and agreed to fight for each other's grievances as though they were our own, then we frequently won. Not always, but frequently. When we didn't, we always lost. I wrote Stone Butch Blues in that spirit, that an injury to one is an injury to all. I had read a lot of gender theory in which I understood every word and every sentence on the page or in the paragraph, but I didn't understand how a single sentence related to my life. And I thought gender theory is not that difficult to understand. It is hard to live, but it is not hard to understand. I wanted to write gender theory that was set in factories and bars and jail cells and coffee shops in which people interacted the way that we really do in our everyday lives, and I wanted to place gender oppression in that context and show that the gender oppression of the black butches on the east side of Buffalo was not the same weight or degree of experience that the white butches that were over by the plants in Riverside were facing. And yet, when we were all together in a bar and the right-wingers came in with their tire irons and their baseball bats, or the cops came in to bust us, and we closed ranks together, we were a mighty force. We had tapped into something that every bit of the establishment here was determined to keep us from tapping into. I wrote several books since then, and the one I wrote after that, Transgender Warriors, was really the heart of my life's work. It was what I kept looking for. I kept looking for it in the library, those little anecdotal bits of evidence, those little references from another period, another historical period, another culture, another place or time, about expressions of gender or sexuality, or even the organization of the sexes that seemed more complex than what I saw around me being enforced. And I wrote it as a cross-cultural, cross-historical look at how this modern sex and gender binary and sexuality binary of either or with nothing in between, which I had been taught is the way it's always been and the way it'll always be, was in fact a relatively recent historical development. But I also was walking a tightrope that any white anti-racist, anti-imperialist activist and writer has to deal with. And whether or not I dealt with it the best way possible remains open to all feedback that I get. But that was that I was not trying and am not trying in any way to analyze or explain or speak for or appropriate a culture or a people or a period other than my own. In fact, I tried to use it to show that it is colonialism and imperialism that has brought this to the world, that has carried out a cultural genocide, that has tried to rewrite history, and has tried to break up the indigenous sexualities and kinship systems and familial relationships and community structure, and then say, but it's always been this way. I wanted to put my onus on colonialism and imperialism, which in fact brought those anti-sodomy laws to Asia, to Africa, to the Americas. The heart, for me, of Transgender Warriors, and this was in keeping with the most militant tradition of analysis of history that I had learned from the liberation movements that went before me was an understanding that we are not hardwired as human beings to be bigoted and selfish and mean-spirited. Now that is a highly contested theory of history, because really the dominant theory of history is what I think of as the Fred Flintstone School of Human Anthropology. The Flintstones was a cartoon version of the Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason. And it was the precursor of what was the futuristic, the Jetsons. So basically, as far back in history as you could look, to the present day, to the future, it's all white, it's all structured the way it is now. It's always been that way, it'll always be that way. So don't fight City Hall. In fact, just go get a six-pack and make it a blockbuster evening, because you just can't change human nature. The idea that there have ever been societies that were organized in a different way is a battlefield. It's a battlefield on any campus. It's a battlefield for any published works. It's a battlefield to stand up and say that it hasn't always been this way. That is truly the most subversive idea that can be put forward by those who defend the status quo by saying, yes, it has always been this way, and we can prove it. We own everything. We own all the media. We own all the educational system. We own the history. We wrote the history. It's always been this way. But the fact is, I went back to the work that had been done over more than 100 years of a materialist look at human history, and saw that the way human society has been organized in different places at different times on different continents has shaped different consciousness. It has changed what we think of as an immutable form of human nature. I mean, now, sure, when you have supermarkets that are just loaded with food that's going to rot if nobody eats it, and you can't eat it unless you have the money to buy it, and if you're poor and you don't have the money, you stand outside looking at that food with your mouth watering, you have to have a dictate that says, thou shalt not steal. But you take a society in which people had to struggle together to hunt and fish and gather to grow crops, and people had to share, and if they didn't, they would starve, and you said, thou shalt not steal, it'd be like, explain that to me. Why would anyone steal? It's a different headset that gets produced by a different way of producing. That's a very radical idea, because if it hasn't always been this way, it means it doesn't always have to be this way. And that's the part that was so summed up so succinctly, I think, by the late black poet June Jordan in her very eloquent statement that we are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the ones who can change it. Therefore, we are the ones who are always being told that we're powerless. Powerless to change it. Powerless to make history. That we're just the objects of history and not the subjects of it. That's what I took up in Transgender Warriors. And I went to the heart of where communal societies began to evolve either gradually over hundreds of years or thousands of years, or were overtaken, were overwhelmed by societies that were already divided into have and have-nots, and found there the earliest edicts that began to actually not only separate the sexes into new configurations assigned to them gender, actually what clothing could be worn, punish those who blurred or bridged that divide, and of course degraded the status of women historically. The next book that I wrote was after a period of being very sick, and here in Buffalo. It was Transliberation Beyond Pink or Blue, and trying to look at all the hues of the palette that were being neglected by that simple color coding of infants, that you know happens immediately in the delivery room. you know, when my partner Minnie Bruce and I first had grandkids, we tried, here were their parents who were like graduates of the Duke, you know, gender studies department, and the first thing they did was take the baby into the delivery room and put a color-coded cap on this child, and all the assumptions that were knitted into this cap right away. I thought, my gosh, can you imagine if this was a rainbow cap on this infant to indicate all the possibilities that were available, you know? And of course, in this country, just decades ago, in the last century, it was completely the opposite, where pink was considered a strong, vibrant boy's color, and powder blue was considered a delicate girl's color, but it was actually the big media hoopla around the sale of Sir Lawrence's Pinky and Gainsborough's Blue Boy that everybody realized, oh no, we had it just the opposite. It's pink is a girl's color and blue is a boy's color. And of course that is so culturally and class specific to this country and to this historical period, because there were a lot of babies before there was color-fast fabric and plumbing and everything else, who wore little white dresses and fabric that was around, and it didn't seem to skew a whole generation of gender expressions in any way. And of course there are many cultures that do not color code their infants, because after all, you know, when someone asks, is the infant a boy or a girl, any evolved culture, particularly this dominant culture, you would think in the 21st century would say, we don't know, the child can't tell us yet. But of course the child didn't have a rainbow cap on, and so we tried really hard, Minnie Bruce and I, not to use a pronoun or to use a gender neutral pronoun for the infant. So people in our neighborhood, and we live in Jersey City, which is the third largest per capita immigrant population in the US. It's very blue-collar area, and while it's not in any way a utopia, it's a wonderful place to live. It really is. And so we went around to different friends in the neighborhood, and they'd say, oh, your grandparents said so wonderful, you know, is it a boy or a girl? And we'd say, oh, we're so happy, the infant's so healthy and so happy and so aware, seems to be so aware of everything around it. And we'd say, well, that's great. And a boy or a girl, and we'd say, and we're so thrilled, we didn't know how we were going to feel about it, but here we got there, and you know, right away we were like bonding, and then there's this look of like, oh, something's wrong. Something's wrong. Now, what is that something that's wrong is a very important part of ways between gender. What is that something might be wrong? That the baby might be something in between, somewhere, not something, somewhere in between male and female. Now that's one of those little secrets that the medical establishment doesn't like to talk about very much, because it skews everything. The minute we talk about intersexuality, hermaphroditism is not a chosen term. It is an old medicalized term. Intersexuality, that exquisite anatomical spectrum between female and male. Now, all those books in the airport, women are from Venus, men are from Mars, out the window they go, because of course it means we're all on the same planet, and there's lots of heavenly bodies in different configurations in the firmament. But what happens when infants are born intersexual? Well, it's treated as a medical emergency. You know, surgeons are rousted from sleep, or endocrinologists are dragged in from golf games as though this is an important medical condition. And in fact, it's not a medical emergency, it's a dominant cultural crisis. It's a dominant social emergency. And infants are being hormonally or surgically carved to fit one or the other of those little boxes on the birth certificates. Now, if the infants are being born in more complex configurations than those little boxes on the birth certificates, why don't they take the birth certificates and chop them into 4 pieces and use them to write notes in the OBGYN ward on? I mean, why are the infants being fit into the boxes? Because there hasn't been a big struggle about it yet. That's because The medical establishment tells parents, and parents have told me many times, how they brought their infant in and the doctor said, we're going to do the surgery. And they said, wait, we want to talk to someone, we want to think about it first. And they said, well, just bring the child in for immunization. And when the child came out, they had a different name and their body had been surgically altered or chemically altered. That's something that gets placed on, if you ask the doctors, they're not trying to be like evil surgeons. They would say, well, you know, I did it for the good of the child. Children can be so cruel. Well, let's take that apart for a moment. First of all, there's a lot of intersexual children who have grown up to say, it was not what I wanted you to do. I had no say when I was 2 days old or 2 weeks or 2 years. And this is a demand that goes to the heart of reproductive rights and the right of each person not to control their own body, but to make decisions large and small about their own bodies and to have choices to make about them. We don't need to control our own bodies. We need to be able to make the decisions about our bodies. And intersexual children have grown up to say, you robbed me of my mosaic. How, after all, is it decided whether a penis is too small or a clitoris too large? It's a very subjective decision, isn't it, for someone else to make about the body. If you ask, they will tell you the decision is made based on whether the child can grow up and have successful heterosexual intercourse. So you see, the children are being tailored for their sexuality at the same time too. I could tell them they could go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or leftbooks.com or any of the independent bookstores like Talking Leaves or any of the other bookstores and find books on how many ways there are to pleasurize each other without having successful heterosexual intercourse. That's not a decision a surgeon has to make about an infant's sexuality later in life. In fact, many of the infants will grow up to never be able to have any kind of sexual sensation because of the surgeries that were done in the early days of their life. So when I hear people talk about their rage at genital mutilation, I say, you do not have to leave the confines of the U.S. in order to take up that battle. It needs to be fought out right here. And it changes our whole view of how many ways there are to have bodies, to come together in different configurations, for love, for pleasure, and to express ourselves through our gender. That creates a much more complex view of the human ability for expression. And in fact, when I went back historically in Transgender Warriors, I could see that even though gender and sexuality and sex has been conceived of so differently in different historical periods and nationalities and regions and classes, eras, that there appears to have always been diversity in the human population, but not oppression and not repression. What we've been taught to accept as just the way things are has been engineered, and we are the ones who can change it. The last book I want to talk to you about is a book in progress. It's a book that I've been writing in a sort of Dickensian fashion. You know, Dickens wrote novels sometimes in weekly installments in the newspaper. That's an interesting way to write a novel, because you don't really know what you're going to write 6 months from then. You just really know what you think you're going to write 6 months from then, but what you're writing that week might take you in a whole different direction than you thought you were going to go. I've been writing a book weekly for almost 3 years in Workers' World newspaper, which I'm a managing editor, called Lavender and Red. And it is a weekly series written in 700 words at a time or 1,400 words at a time about the last century and a half of the struggle for sex and gender and sexuality freedoms in its relationship to the revolutionary movements for change and the earliest attempts at socialist revolution. And I think this has been an important exercise for me because, frankly, I hadn't realized how many gains had been made, how much the left wing of the left wing had supported these demands so early on. But it's also a series in which I spend perhaps more time dealing with the problems and the weaknesses in the movements than the gains. Because unlike those who tell us that this is the end of history, that in fact this is it, capitalism is the highest form of economic and social organization to which humankind can aspire, and trying to demoralize us to think that it is impossible for us to ever create an economy that is planned to meet not just what people need, but what we desire, what we don't even know yet we might desire if it was possible to have, has been constantly under siege by saying, sure, it must be bad here, it's bad here, but it's worse. It's worse when people try to revolutionize society. And that's not true. What is true is that every revolutionary struggle and every revolutionary movement, just like every revolutionary individual, is in a constant struggle for consciousness and change, to free ourselves of them, of all that we have been taught after centuries and millennia of divide and conquer rule. And the degree to which we shed those harmful illusions is the degree to which we become revolutionary. And that is true of movements and struggles, and it is true of the countries that have worked to rid themselves of centuries and millennia of the legacy of this kind of thinking. And it's not an overnight process. A revolution is not a single act, it is a process. And so, rather than try to bring it to you here tonight, and in any way either focus too much on problems or too much on accomplishments, I would make available to you the website www.workers.org, and if you look for the little black logo with the lavender and red symbol and you click on it, you will find the first 63 parts of it. And if you go in the back, you can have a copy of the newspaper that has part 64 in it. This whole month is looking at the actual Stonewall Rebellion blow by blow for what actually happened inside the bar when the cops came in, and what happened when the crowd started growing outside, and the composition, of how the most marginalized, the most oppressed began to gather in that park across the street, and what ignited the upsurge that night, and how the cops were forced to retreat in the bar, and how the crowd uprooted a parking meter and tried to use it as a battering ram to get in at the police, and how they tried to burn the bar down with the police inside, and how that rebellion continued for 4 nights running, and why it was such a qualitative turning point. And with that article is also an article that I wrote about really the crushing, the pogrom against the Moscow Pride March last Saturday, which is, remember all those Pepsi commercials? It was all going to be democracy and freedom, and just let them overturn the Soviet Union, and they were just going to bring freedom. And really, this is the growth of a neo-fascist movement here. And the last thing I just want to say, and I appreciate you all being patient with this because I know it's kind of hot and stuffy in here. My grandmother could see me here now. Truly, she would be surprised. And I know those pews are hard, but I want to say one thing that is in keeping with what I've been talking about ways and gender, in terms of specifically the war drive. Because have you noticed how the Pentagon and whoever's in the White House, whether it was a Clinton or a Bush or a Reagan or a Ford or Carter, they always say, they never say, follow us, we're going to re-enslave all those who have tried to break with colonialism or imperialism. We are going to re-enslave those who are trying to defend a modicum of their right to self-determination and sovereignty. Come with us and be ready to die and to kill. They don't do that. It's not popular. It's not. They have spin doctors. They hire ad agencies. I mean, that Wag the Dog is not a movie. It's real. In 1991, when the U.S. wanted to invade Iraq, and they said, well, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that Iraqi soldiers were bayoneting Kuwaiti infants in incubators in hospitals. Well, actually, the U.S. had allowed Kuwait to slant drill under the Iraq border to siphon off the oil, and then said to the Iraqis, gee, that's terrible, we wouldn't mind if you stopped that. And then when Iraq went in, they said, that's it, they're killing Kuwaiti babies. Do you know that several years later, the Chicago ad agency that made up that lie actually advertised in their trade journals saying, hire us as your ad agency, we're the ones that sold that lie that started the war. That's how blatant it was. The attempt to make the war be a humanitarian effort, as though the Pentagon is a great Meals on Wheels, a great vehicle of women's liberation, so concerned about the lives of lesbian and gay people around the world, is something that it can divert segments of our movements for progressive change if we can't answer, if we can't explain it. And to those who know it's wrong, but can't explain it, and if the movement doesn't confront it, it's just demoralizing. It just allows the tank treads to just roll right over us. Remember when Laura Bush actually uttered the words women's liberation? She got on, and when was it? When she was pitching the war, the invasion of Afghanistan. And she talked about how the Pentagon was going to go in and liberate the women of Afghanistan. And there were white women who were icons of second wave feminism who signed a letter saying, go in there and liberate those women. Send the troops, send the tanks, send the daisy cutters. Well, where are women in Afghanistan today? And here's what they didn't say. They didn't say that the Afghan people tried to make a revolution against feudalism in which women did not have names. And when they tried to make that revolution, the U.S. armed the same counter-revolutionary forces that now they claim they have to go in because they're terrorists. And they tried to drown that revolution in blood. And what did that revolution do? It abolished the bride price. It created jobs and education and political opportunities for women in Afghanistan. And even, you know who says this? Not just me, in my newspaper. The U.S. Army report talks about the gains for women in the revolution. They drown it in blood. And then when they couldn't get that pipeline through to steal all that wealth of oil and natural gas from the Caspian Sea area that they had broken off from the former Soviet Union, they decided now the Taliban is the enemy. And they threatened to go in the summer before 9/11. 9/11 was the pretext. We have to be able to answer that. If we don't, what does it do when Laura Bush becomes the spokesperson for women's liberation? And these crimes against the people of Afghanistan are carried out in all our names. Our anti-war movement has to be able to articulate and define what women's liberation really means and how to unite to defend the women of Afghanistan and the men and the other sexes and sexualities and genders of Afghanistan and the Middle East from imperialist intervention. The same thing now is coming up around Iran, and that's why I wanted to conclude on this. You will read in the last year, now I don't think many people would argue now that the U.S. went into Afghanistan to liberate women or gay people. But there was plenty in the LGBT media about how terrible it was in Afghanistan, which, I don't want to idealize life under the Taliban, but, suddenly it was all about how terrible it was for gay people in Afghanistan. And then there was stuff about Iran. Now, they couldn't say how terrible it was for women in Iraq because women enjoyed the highest living standard in Iraq of any country in the Middle East, so that they decided to shift away from it. Suddenly it was weapons of mass destruction. You know, whether there's an internal danger that the US has to go in and fix, or the external danger. But the fact is that now, a year before what is a proposed invasion or economic strangulation of Iran, the second largest oil resources in the Middle East, the articles are appearing about what it's like for gay and transsexual Iranians. And I think this is very important for our discussion about ways, all the ways of gender, both the in-between and the poles, all the spectra of gender and sexuality and sexes. Because what does it mean to be a gay Iranian? Is this an exporting of an identity? Is there the same identity in Iran as there is in Christopher Street, or will be on Delaware or Elmwood this weekend, or in the Castro district in San Francisco? Is this a universal identity that until the rest of the world adopts, they're not out of the closet yet? And the US or the communities and movements here have to liberate people from around the world, and that requires regime change and economic pressure and perhaps even military intervention. The first article that was the most widely touted, that traveled all over the internet at such speed it reminded me of that adage that you know, the lie travels around the world while the truth is still tying its sneakers, was about how the Iranian government was carrying out a state-sponsored lynchings, pogroms of gay Iranians. And the photos from an execution appeared on web pages of Andrew Sullivan, the gay neocon journalist, and the webpage of Doug Ireland, who is a social democratic gay journalist, within hours from this small town in Iran. You can think, how does news from a small town in Iran get to us in the US overnight, when most of us have been told very little about this 5,000-year-old culture? But they got it very quickly, and they said, two gay Iranians were executed, it's a pogrom, and it's going on, and it's widespread. But what happened was that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people read that. But what many people didn't read was when later it turned out that there had been a mistranslation. And it was not a charge of homosexuality, but a charge of homosexual rape of a group of older men who had kidnapped and raped a younger boy. The next set of articles talked about how terrible it was for a transsexual who was interviewed in Iran. Not one thing in that article mentioned that Tehran extends more rights to transsexuals than any other government on the planet. Low-cost government loans for sex reassignment, free hormones, sound like anything you've ever heard of in the US? My point about this is not to overly defend, not to defend or apologize or explain away for oppression anywhere on the planet, here included, but to say this, that to say that the US and Britain need to carry out a regime change in Iran in order to rescue women and gay people and transsexuals and trade unionists from their elected government, their ancient religion, and their 5-millennium-old culture. It is impossible to separate that from the saber-rattling of the powers that already carried out a regime change once in Iran. They brought the Shah of Iran, and they brought torture and suffering, and what they're mad at the Iranian government for is 27 years of having kicked them out. That's what they're mad at. And I think that on the one hand, we need to be able to stay the hand of the US war makers, because that's our job here. And on the other hand, we have to also be able to be open to understanding that there are other cultures that have different indigenous sexualities and familial and kinship systems and organizations of the sexes, so that the idea that Tehran is really supportive of transsexuals and sex reassignment. Why is that? We need to understand more about Iranian culture and not impose through an insensitivity or an unconscious chauvinism the attitudes from this country. We are not the enemies of the Iranian people, and the Iranian people are not our enemies. That historical moment for our movement, and every movement has to answer where it's, not where it stands, where it's going to, what it will defend in terms of war and racism and reaction, is the moment that our movements are being called upon to answer now. For those who ask, how could Japanese Americans have been rounded up and interned in concentration camps in California and Arizona in World War II? This is how it begins, with the disappearing of Muslim and South Asian and Arab neighbors and friends and co-workers. And certainly we're seeing that happen in Jersey City where I live and in other parts of the country. The deepening of the racism that already exists. I know I recognize some people here. We were together in the Jim Crow Must Go, the Jim Crow busting action out at the Galleria Mall, where we dropped that huge banner that said shopping while black is not a crime, and marched through the chanting that kind of racist profiling that has gone on for so long is now being elevated to color-coded national alerts for racist profiling. And it's coming in a period in which I don't have to tell anyone here that the cities are being starved to pay for the war. And that brings me to why I wrote Drag King Dreams and what this novel is about. And so, if you'd allow me to, I'd like to just read a little bit from the beginning of Drag King Dreams. And the reason I'd like to read the beginning of it is, I don't know about you, but reading doesn't come all that easy for me. It hasn't in my life. And if anyone ever read the first chapter to me, and I knew I was starting on chapter 2, it would be a lot easier to jump into the book. So I'm going to just read you this very short chapter, chapter 1, from Drag King Dreams. Who cares what anybody's got between their legs? Vicky whispers in exasperation. I'm the choir she's preaching to, so I figure she doesn't really expect an answer. My gaze is steely, fixed on the red-faced, blustering man who is pounding on the closed half-train car doors. His confrontation has lasted throughout the train ride under the Hudson River into Jersey. It began as a headache. It has become a throbbing migraine. Now Vicky and I are on the platform. The car doors closed, separating Vicky and me from the man wildly flailing to get at us, the uncaged beasts. His shouts are muffled. The rubber-rimmed plastic windows bounce with his every wallop. I can feel my own fist clench bloodlessly tight at my sides. My heart is pumping adrenaline. Quite a ride home, Vicky says. Is it always like this at night? I'm immersed in the deep currents of this instant. It's like this wherever I go. My throat tightens around the words. The livid man tries to unzip his pants, rummaging between his legs to transform a penis into a weapon. But his zipper jams halfway, and his hand is stuck. He's spitting hatred, fueled by fury. If Ruby were here, she would lift up her miniskirt and waggle her bottom against the subway pane right in front of him. I smile thinly, mockingly, and waggle my little finger at him. Vicky slaps my shoulder lightly, involuntarily. She's horrified. You're gonna make him madder. My laughter sounds shallow. He can't get much madder than this. The timbre of her voice drops. Are you scared? I don't feel anything. I'm numb in this long wintry night. I'm not scared of him, I say. I'm scared of how many there are. Vicky needs reassurance. This is not her terrain. She's an activist, not a street fighter. Together we could take him. My tone is mechanical, bitter. Besides, I don't think he really wants to get at us. If it were me and I wanted to get my hands on someone, I'd go out the door between the subway cars and I'd be out on this platform before they could swallow their tongue. Vicky pales. This does not reassure her. We are watching the apoplectic man raging behind the transparent barrier of plastic. Inside the train car, late-night riders and early commuters gape at us. Across the tracks, the early rush hour crowd gawks at the whole scene, spectacle staring at spectacle. Come on, Max, let's go, Vicky tugs my coat sleeve. We're just pissing him off more by standing here. I shake my head slowly from side to side. I won't turn my back until I'm sure the doors of the car will not reopen. From the next car, the conductor slides a little window open and leans out before signaling all clear to the motorman, who in this case is a woman. The conductor sees everyone frozen, focused in one direction. He hesitates, squeezing further out the window to locate the ruckus. He tips his head toward the hollering from the next car and looks at me quizzically. He's friendly, the guy I give my newspaper to at the end of my ride most evenings. I lift my chin toward the problem and shake my head. Don't open the door. He nods ever so slightly and flashes me a weary smile. His diamond earring glints against his earlobe, a glittering star. I can see at a glance that Vicky doesn't catch any of this. The conductor pulls himself back inside and slides the window shut. The train is slowly moving out from under the iron beam canopy of the Journal Square station. I smile and wave at the man who wants to kill us as he goes by, taunting him, knowing I may see him again. My head aches as the tide of adrenaline starts to ebb. I'm tired, cranky. I've been up a long time, all night long. The only thing that feels real to me right now is the raw rock tunnel around us, a short alleyway through an urban mountain. Outcropped boulders, locked into place with bolts as big as my arm, gathered up in steel hairnets. I look out the end of the tunnel toward the glowing cobalt sky. Almost dawn, I tell Vicky. I've got to get home. There'll be another train to Newark soon. I'll wait with you. The platform across from us is crowded with those headed to New York. Their backs are to us as they huddle and position themselves for the next train's arrival. Too many people forced to compete for too few seats. Vicky shakes her head as though she could dislodge the experience. I couldn't go through this all the time, she sighs. This is not the way I want to fight. My anger flares like a match, the scent of sulfur in my nostrils. My tone is curt, resentful. I don't have a choice. I've struck a nerve. Vicky's eyes brim with pain, her voice cools. It's not that simple, Max, you know that. I chafe with irritation. You can just go back to being Vic. I can't just change my clothes and go back to the day world and be a lawyer. I say each word carefully, like I'm teaching her. As I hear the words out loud, I'm sorry they're coming out of my own mouth. Vicky clenches her lips tight until they almost disappear. She absent-mindedly adjusts her wig by feel. I wish the next train would hurry up and arrive. They don't run very often in these pre-dawn hours. I lean forward on the platform and peer down the track to see if the signal lights are green. I dig my hands into the deep pockets of my pea coat, thick as a wool blanket, and stomp my boot heels on the platform to warm myself. You don't have to wait, Vicky Vicky's tenor is as icy as her breath. I'm a big boy. I make an effort to ease the tension between us. Is Estelle going to pick you up at the station and drive you home? Vicky leans forward to look for signs of a train. No. No? She's visibly impatient. No, I told her, sleep in and don't worry about me. I'll be home for breakfast and get a few hours sleep. I have to see clients all afternoon. We stand next to each other, awkward. You live far from here, she asks. Small talk. Nah, just a couple of blocks. I hear the shriek of a whistle as the train to Newark roars out of the tunnel towards us. I can see a glimpse of the western Jersey sky lightening. That means to the east, across the Hudson River, the sun is inching up behind Wall Street. I'm anxious to get home before the day begins. Go, she suggests. I look at my boot heels as I stomp them. I'm sorry, I say. I mean it, but it sounds flat. She nods perfunctorily. Go home, Max. Go to bed. The train pulls up next to us, slowing down with a screech. You got your camera, I think, to ask? She pats the big leather purse slung across her shoulder. We wave goodbye to each other, half-heartedly, as I turn away. Relieved to be alone, I take the stairs, 2 at a time, up and out of the station into the frosty outdoors. The service road is still narrowed by post-9/11 barricades, its entryway watched over by a guard hunching over for warmth in the little wooden sentry station. The soldiers are gone now. No more teenagers in fatigues, automatic weapons slung over shoulders, clustered nervously around armored Humvees, ordered to search for an enemy in every face. Now there's only the spiny branched trees, dark silhouettes against the lavender rim of the sky. No bird song, my every breath a cloud. My lungs ache, I cough, and my nose hairs bristle. The air itself could shatter into shards. There is safety in cold like this. As I walk, I cast no shadow on the concrete. A pale sun begins its arc through streaks of salmon. Daylight is shortening the night. Frozen plumes of smoke and steam hover in the air, the breath of the city. I pull the brim of my cap down low over my eyes and tug up my scarf to warm my ears. I can smell my body, my own echo niche, reeking of other people's tobacco and stale beer. It's been a long time since I felt the sun on my body, seen my own slender shadow follow me, that little sliver of night I take wherever I go. I'm on my block now, almost home. The traffic lights are still set to blink. Yellow suns flashing. Caution, caution. This book is about gender queerness, like Stone Butch Blues, in the historical moment in which it's lived. I don't describe to you the race, so-called race, or nationality, or sexuality, or gender expression, or sex of any character in this book. It doesn't mean they don't identify themselves through interaction or through the obstacles they face. But I wanted to confront 2 pitfalls that I think are, or even a minefield for white writers. And one is what I call the default characters, which means if they're white, if they're skinny, if they're able-bodied, if they're straight, no need to mention it. But if they're not in that default, then they need to be identified the moment they walk onto the scene. And the second is that this is about a circle of, for lack of a better term, genderqueer characters who are marginalized in the workforce on the Lower East Side and in Jersey City, working 3rd shift in a drag bar. And I've been very conscious of the way the metaphors of darkness and light, of black and white, of so often used by white writers as well in an unconscious way. And in this book, the metaphors of night and day and of darkness and light are turned on their heads. I don't want to tell you anything else about this book. I want you to be free to go on this journey. You'll bring to it things that I didn't bring to it. You'll read it in a different way than I read it, because your whole life informs the way you read it, all your experiences, all the burdens that you bear in life. But I can leave you just with this one thought before we open up for discussion, and that is that I hope this book doesn't just speak to you, I hope it sings to you. Thank you. To hear what's on your mind, and I want to have more time to be able to talk to you one-on-one, and so what's on your minds? Oh, wow. What am I most proud of so far, and what am I looking forward to? Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back. You know, I don't know. So much of my work is not about individual work, it's about collective work. And I think what I feel most proud of are all the times that I see us be able to find ways to come together when everything has been designed to keep us apart. I'm thinking of and I want to talk more about it at the Dyke March and at the Pride March on Sunday, the different ways, for example, that we've tried to unite right here in Buffalo to fight back. What I'm looking forward to, well, Bennett High School's slogan I was just remembering was Optima Futura, Latin for the best is yet to be. After my experiences in high school, I can only tell you that was a very true slogan. I have a lot of optimism for the future. And you might wonder why, based on the situation we're in. And really, talk about Dickens, this really is the worst of times, but it has the seeds of the best of times in it too. I feel like I'm watching the whole upper establishment moving to the right, and that's both sides of the aisle of Congress, and the White Houses and the governor's mansions, and and I'm watching the population just incrementally, almost unconsciously, hour by hour, day by day, moving to the left. I think that there are massive historical crimes that are going on that have not been acknowledged. We've talked about the war a little bit, but I want to talk about Katrina. I mean, here is added to the crimes of the Middle Passage, the horror of the Middle Passage, the Holocaust of the slave trade, the tearing apart of families, slavery in this country, the reparations long overdue, long deferred. Suddenly comes a storm, and the levees didn't hold, and it's presented as a natural disaster, when in fact the money that would have fortified the levees went to expand, finance capital's war against the people of the Middle East. And once again, a forced diaspora of predominantly African American people torn away from their families, split up around the country, rendered invisible, right now being kicked out of hotels and motels in New York City, being told, sorry, no more hotel space is going to be available. These are the kinds of crimes that we open up the newspapers and don't read about, and yet their impact is immeasurable. It would have been impossible to think where a struggle of immigrant workers who are undocumented, whose status in this country is criminalized for lack of documents, could come out into the streets without the hated La Migra, now called ICE. And they are truly ICE, rounding people up. And yet, when people came out by the millionfold, within a period of weeks, it reminded me of these conditions. Whenever continental plates begin to shift incrementally, it creates a friction that eventually gives way to a social earthquake. And there's a infrequently quoted and wonderful quote by a great revolutionary, Lenin, once said that sometimes decades go by and nothing seems to happen. And then weeks go by and decades happen. And I am optimistic about what is to come, because I feel that we are, while no one has a crystal ball and no one can predict when and where or what will ignite the social conflagration, that we are on the eve of decades happening. And I feel confident that I'm in a room filled with people who I will find next to me in all these situations, just like in all these struggles, just as I have in recent years when I've come back to Buffalo at key moments. What else? Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, but you. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's led down the path of being inspirational speaking?
What would you say that?
What kind of advice would you give someone who's new to inspirational speaking?
What kind of advice would I give to somebody who's new to inspirational speaking? I can only say for my own self that I try to make sure that I really mean what I say. How to bridge the gaps in the trans community around age and class and other differences? In Buffalo? Well, I gotta tell you, first and foremost, that question goes to the heart of movement building, and I appreciate that question. And I also can't answer it, because it would be easy for me to say, well, we should just do this and we should just do that, but it would be arrogant. The fact is that there is no generalized approach. There's no one solution to unity building in any community or communities. I mean, it's very specific to Buffalo and the communities here and the leadership here and the consciousness of those who are going to help bring about that unity. I would love to have more discussions with you about the basis for unity here, and I hope to do that over the weekend. But I want you to know, when I say I can't answer, I mean it out of the greatest respect for the question, that it is such an important question that I don't want to give any easy, glib answers. That is the task. That is the task of this moment. And I have a feeling that the person who can ask the question is the person who's going to be instrumental in answering it. And on that basis, I want to thank you. I cannot tell you how much it means to me to come back to Buffalo. More than 40 years after I first came out into the bars here in Buffalo, in Niagara Falls, in Toronto, in Rochester, and be here with you all and be out marching with you on Saturday and Sunday. I hope everyone will be there at the Dyke March. I hope everyone will be there Sunday at the Pride March. And I hope to see you all on that road of activism, that long road with many paths. I'm sure I will see you all again. Thank you for welcoming me home.